By the spring of 1944, nearly 3 full years had passed since the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor that had drawn America into the war in the Pacific. During those years, the entire strategic situation had undergone a complete reversal. The United States, which had initially found itself reeling backward across the vast ocean, desperately trying to hold defensive positions while the Japanese military machine seemed unstoppable, had now seized the initiative and begun a methodical advance westward. This American offensive employed what military planners called the island hopping strategy, a carefully calculated approach that involved capturing key islands while bypassing others, steadily tightening the noose around the Japanese home islands with each successive landing. The situation had reached a critical juncture when American forces set their sights on Saipan, located in the Mariana Islands. This wasn't just another island in the vast Pacific theater. The significance of Saipan to Japanese strategic planners could hardly be overstated. For years, this island chain had served as an outer defensive barrier, a shield protecting the homeland from direct aerial assault. Should Saipan fall into American hands, the consequences would be catastrophic for Japan. The island's capture would place the major population centers and industrial facilities of the Japanese mainland within range of the new American heavy bomber, the B-29 Superfortress, for the first time in the war. These massive aircraft possessed the range and payload capacity to deliver devastating strategic bombing campaigns against Japanese cities, something that had previously been impossible due to the vast distances involved. Recognizing the existential threat posed by the potential loss of Saipan, the leadership at Japanese Imperial General Headquarters found themselves with no choice but to commit everything they had left. The decision was made to stake the future of the empire on one massive naval engagement. Admiral Toyota Soemu, commanding the combined fleet, authorized the launch of Operation A-Go, a plan designed to draw the American fleet into a decisive battle where superior Japanese tactics and fighting spirit might overcome the growing material disadvantage. The operational concept drew heavily on the traditional doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement that had been central to Japanese naval thinking for decades. The Japanese placed their hopes in Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, who would command the mobile fleet in this crucial operation. Ozawa's force represented virtually everything Japan had left in terms of carrier aviation. He sailed with 9 aircraft carriers bearing approximately 500 aircraft on their decks and in their hangars. Supporting these flat tops were 5 battleships, their massive guns still formidable despite the carrier's emergence as the dominant naval weapon. 13 cruisers and more than 30 destroyers rounded out the fleet, providing anti-aircraft protection and screening duties. Beyond these shipboard aircraft, Japanese commanders counted on nearly 300 additional planes stationed at airfields on nearby islands, particularly Guam and Rota, to supplement the carrier strikes and tip the balance in Japan's favor. The force arrayed against this Japanese fleet was truly staggering. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the United States Fifth Fleet, with operational control of the carrier forces delegated to Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, who led Task Force 58. The American armada included 15 aircraft carriers, nearly double the Japanese number, with close to 900 aircraft ready to launch from their decks. 7 fast battleships, products of American industrial might, steamed alongside the carriers, their modern fire control systems and heavy anti-aircraft batteries providing a nearly impenetrable shield. 21 cruisers and nearly 60 destroyers completed this massive formation. In terms of sheer numbers and material superiority, the Americans possessed an overwhelming advantage that grew more pronounced with each passing month as American shipyards continued launching new vessels at an incredible pace. Both the Japanese and American commanders understood perfectly well what was at stake in the coming engagement. This wouldn't be just another naval skirmish in the island-hopping campaign. The outcome would determine not merely the fate of the Marianas, important as those islands were, but would likely decide the trajectory of the entire Pacific War. Victory for Japan might buy time, perhaps even force the Americans to reconsider their strategy. Defeat, on the other hand, could prove catastrophic, potentially spelling the end of Japan's ability to contest American naval supremacy anywhere in the Pacific. Within just 2 days, the waters of the Philippine Sea would bear witness to the largest carrier versus carrier battle in the history of naval warfare. The engagement would demonstrate conclusively which nation had mastered carrier aviation and would earn a nickname from American pilots that would echo through the decades to come. They would call it, with dark humor born of the one-sided slaughter they witnessed, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. As the first light of dawn broke over the Pacific Ocean on the 19th of June in 1944, Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on the flag bridge of his flagship Taiho, one of the most modern carriers in the Japanese fleet. His eyes scanned the eastern horizon, knowing with certainty that somewhere beyond that gradually brightening line where sea met sky, the American fleet was steaming, preparing for the same battle he was about to initiate. At exactly 45 minutes past 4 in the morning, Ozawa gave the order for the first reconnaissance aircraft to launch. These scout planes would search the vast ocean for any sign of the enemy fleet, transmitting coordinates the moment they made contact. Almost simultaneously, hundreds of miles to the east, American commanders were making identical preparations. Their scout planes roared off carrier decks into the pre-dawn darkness, fanning out across the search sectors in their own hunt for the Japanese force. By 10 minutes before 6 o'clock that morning, one of the Japanese reconnaissance pilots achieved success. His Zero fighter had located the American fleet, and he immediately began transmitting the position coordinates back to Ozawa. Having completed his primary mission, the pilot made a fateful decision. Rather than simply return with his invaluable intelligence, he chose to attack, diving toward an American destroyer that was screening the main force. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A wall of anti-aircraft fire erupted from the destroyer and nearby ships, filling the sky with tracers and shell bursts. The Japanese plane never had a chance. It plummeted into the sea, marking the battle's first casualty and serving as an omen of what was to come. The brief action triggered alarm throughout both fleets. On Guam, Japanese squadrons that had been on standby rushed to prepare their aircraft for launch, intending to join the carrier planes in attacking the American fleet. But American radar operators, scanning their scopes with practiced eyes, had already detected these aircraft taking off. Warning bells rang across the American carriers, and within minutes, flight deck crews were scrambling to launch interceptors. From the deck of USS Belleau Wood, a squadron of Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters thundered into the sky, their powerful engines driving them rapidly toward the enemy. At the Japanese airfield on Rota, pilots were still in the process of getting their aircraft airborne when the American Hellcats arrived overhead like avenging hawks. What followed was brief but brutal. The Japanese planes, caught in the vulnerable moments of takeoff and assembly, proved easy targets for the experienced American pilots. Their Hellcats dove through the scattered Japanese formation, machine guns chattering. In less than 1 hour of combat, 35 Japanese aircraft had been shot out of the sky or destroyed on the ground. American losses amounted to a single Hellcat. The survivors of the Japanese strike force, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, abandoned their planned mission and scattered, attempting to return to base or find somewhere safe to land. With the threat from the island-based aircraft effectively neutralized, at least for the moment, the American fleet could now direct its full attention to dealing with Ozawa's main carrier force. Aboard the flagship USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Mitcher stood calmly observing the radar displays, waiting for the inevitable appearance of Japanese strike aircraft. His wait was not long. At precisely 8:30 in the morning, the radar screens suddenly lit up with what appeared to be hundreds of contacts, all approaching from the western direction. Ozawa had launched his strikes, and they were now inbound toward the American fleet. The Japanese admiral had committed his forces in 3 separate waves, hoping to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers and the coordination of multiple attacks from different directions. Force C had launched 69 aircraft in the first wave. Force A followed with a massive strike of 128 planes. Force B contributed 47 additional aircraft. In total, within less than an hour, the Japanese had put 244 aircraft into the air, all heading toward the American carriers with bombs and torpedoes. By 10 o'clock that morning, American radar operators picked up the first incoming wave at an impressive distance of 240 kilometers. Mitchell wasted no time. He immediately ordered every available Hellcat fighter into the air and recalled the patrols that had been operating near Guam. Within minutes, the sky above the American fleet was filled with climbing fighters, forming a layered defense that extended dozens of miles from the carriers they protected. In the leading Japanese formation, a pilot named Masatoshi Nakagawa led his group of dive bombers through the clear morning sky, searching for the American carriers that intelligence had reported in this area. When the strike force had closed to approximately 100 kilometers from their expected target location, the commanders made a decision that would prove fatal. Concerned about maintaining formation cohesion, they ordered the aircraft to pause their advance and regroup, tightening up their formations before the final approach. This delay, born of caution and doctrine, gave the American defenders precious additional minutes to position themselves. At 36 minutes past 10 in the morning, American Hellcats struck from above. The Japanese pilots, focused on maintaining formation and searching ahead for targets, suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions as the American fighters dove through their ranks. The sky erupted into chaos. Twisting, turning aircraft filled the air as Japanese pilots desperately tried to defend themselves while maintaining their attack formation. Within the first few minutes of combat, 25 Japanese planes had been shot down, tumbling in flames toward the ocean far below. The Americans lost a single Hellcat in this initial clash. Before the Japanese could recover, another 16 of their aircraft fell to the guns of additional Hellcat squadrons that tore into the increasingly desperate formation. Many of the surviving Japanese pilots, recognizing that they would never reach the American carriers through such opposition, made the painful decision to jettison their bombs and torpedoes into the sea. Lightened of their weapons, they attempted to escape, engines screaming as they dove for the deck or climbed for cloud cover. A handful of the most determined, or perhaps simply the luckiest pilots, managed to push through the fighter screen, only to immediately encounter the full fury of the American fleet's anti-aircraft defenses. The sight that greeted these few Japanese attackers who broke through must have been terrifying. Hundreds of 5-inch guns, their barrels tracking smoothly on modern fire control systems, opened fire in coordinated salvos. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells, each burst sending thousands of metal fragments sleeting through the air. 40mm Bofors guns added their distinctive rhythmic pounding to the cacophony, creating a wall of fire that seemed impossible to penetrate. The Americans had developed proximity-fused shells that exploded when they sensed an aircraft nearby, eliminating the need for direct hits and making every shot exponentially more dangerous to the attackers. One Japanese bomb did manage to find a target, slamming into the deck of the battleship USS South Dakota with tremendous force. The impact shook the massive vessel, and the explosion killed or wounded more than 50 sailors who had been manning their battle stations. But the battleship's heavy armor plating, designed to withstand punishment from enemy battleships, prevented any catastrophic damage. Damage control parties quickly contained the fires, and the South Dakota maintained her position in the formation, her guns never ceasing their fire at the attacking aircraft. Remarkably, despite everything the Japanese had thrown at them, not a single attacking aircraft succeeded in reaching the American aircraft carriers. When the first wave finally broke off and the survivors limped back toward their own fleet, the butcher's bill was horrific. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft that had launched in this initial strike, 42 had been destroyed. Only 27 made it back to report on the disaster. A brief, almost eerie quiet settled over the Philippine Sea as the smoke from the first engagement drifted away on the breeze. But every sailor and pilot on both sides knew this was merely a pause, the eye of a storm that would soon resume with renewed fury. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was only beginning. Aboard the carrier Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and countless battles since, Japanese deck crews worked with desperate speed to prepare another strike. Despite the losses from the first wave, Admiral Ozawa remained confident, or perhaps simply unwilling to accept the possibility of defeat. His intelligence officers had assured him that the American fleet had suffered significant damage, that his pilots had successfully attacked multiple carriers. Operating on this mistaken belief, Ozawa made the decision to commit the remainder of his available aircraft. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he ordered the launch of a second massive strike, this one comprising 129 aircraft. Near the middle of the day, at 7 minutes past 11, American radar operators once again detected their screens lighting up with incoming contacts. Another large formation of Japanese aircraft was approaching from the southwest. The American fighter directors, having seen how effectively their tactics had worked during the first engagement, prepared to repeat their success. Hellcat fighters already airborne moved to intercept, while additional squadrons launched to reinforce them. At a distance of 60 miles from the American fleet, approximately 97 kilometers, and well before the Japanese pilots could even catch sight of their targets on the horizon, they found themselves under attack. American Hellcats dove from superior altitude, using their height advantage and superior speed to slash through the Japanese formations. The engagement was even more one-sided than the first. Within mere minutes of the initial contact, approximately 70 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, their burning wreckage scattered across miles of ocean. The American pilots, growing more confident with each victory, pressed their attacks with aggressive determination. A small number of Japanese aircraft managed to fight their way through this aerial massacre and continued toward the American fleet. These survivors split into multiple groups, attempting to coordinate their attacks from different directions to divide the defensive fire. 6 dive bombers broke away from the main formation and plunged toward Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery's carrier task group. Their bombs fell toward USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill, missing direct hits but exploding close enough alongside to send towering columns of water over the carrier's decks. Several fires broke out, and there were casualties among the crews, but fortunately for the Americans, the near misses caused only minor damage. Both carriers continued operating, recovering and launching aircraft without significant interruption. Another group of Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers, known to the Americans by the code name Jill, selected USS Enterprise as their primary target. This carrier held special significance for the Japanese, as she had been a thorn in their side throughout the war, participating in numerous raids and battles. The Japanese Naval Command had long desired to sink Enterprise, viewing her as a symbol of American resistance. The torpedo bombers made their approach low over the water, aiming to drop their torpedoes at close range where they might be impossible to evade. But every single torpedo missed its target, either through skillful maneuvering by the Enterprise or simple misfortune on the part of the attackers. 3 additional torpedo bombers attempted to strike USS Princeton, but they were blown apart by concentrated anti-aircraft fire from the carrier and her escorts almost the moment they came within range. When the second wave finally broke off and headed back to the Japanese fleet, the losses were even more catastrophic than those of the first strike. 97 of the 129 aircraft that had launched never returned to their carriers. Their pilots and air crews were dead, either shot down over the ocean or killed when their damaged aircraft crashed attempting to land. The sun climbed higher in the sky as noon approached, its light reflecting off the oil slicks that marked where aircraft had plunged into the sea. The temperature rose, making conditions inside the ships increasingly uncomfortable, but neither side could afford to slow down or take a break. The Japanese, despite their mounting losses, persisted with stubborn determination. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Ozawa launched yet a third strike, this one comprising 47 aircraft from his northern carrier group. The plan was to attack the American fleet from a different angle, hoping to find a weak point in their defences or catch them off guard while they were recovering and rearming aircraft from the previous engagements. But luck was not with the Japanese that day. At a distance of 80 kilometers from the American fleet, well before they could begin their attack runs, the formation ran headlong into 40 Hellcat fighters that had been vectored to intercept them. Taken completely by surprise, the Japanese formation broke apart as pilots scattered in every direction, all cohesion lost. In the swirling dogfight that followed, only 7 Japanese aircraft were shot down, far fewer than in the earlier massacres. However, the survivors, recognizing the impossibility of continuing their mission in such disarray, abandoned the attack entirely. They jettisoned their bombs and torpedoes into the sea to lighten their aircraft for the flight home. 40 planes managed to return safely to their carriers, a rare stroke of good fortune for Ozawa on this disastrous day. Still unwilling to concede defeat, still believing that his strikes must have inflicted significant damage on the Americans, Ozawa committed his final reserves. Between 11 o'clock and 11:30 in the morning, even as the second wave was being slaughtered, the Japanese carriers had launched a fourth and final strike comprising 84 aircraft. But fate, which had already shown itself to be cruel to the Japanese throughout this battle, now played its cruelest trick yet. The intelligence that had guided the earlier strikes, already questionable in its accuracy, proved completely wrong for this final group. The coordinates they had been given for the American fleet's position were significantly in error. The strike force flew toward empty ocean, searching desperately for targets that simply weren't where they were supposed to be. As the miles passed beneath them, and their fuel gauges crept lower and lower, the terrible reality became clear to the flight commanders. They couldn't find the American fleet, and they wouldn't have enough fuel to return to their own carriers. Unable to complete their mission and unable to return home, the commanders made the only decision available to them. They ordered the formation to split, with one group heading for Guam and another making for Rota, hoping to land at those island bases, refuel, and perhaps try again. The withdrawal, however, was anything but safe or orderly. The group heading for Rota, purely by bad luck, blundered directly into the path of Rear Admiral Montgomery's task force. American Hellcats that had been flying combat air patrol over the carriers spotted the Japanese aircraft and immediately rose to intercept. In the brief but vicious clash that followed, 18 Japanese planes were engaged. Only half managed to escape into the clouds or outrun their pursuers. The other 9 were shot down, adding to the day's mounting toll. At the same time, the group attempting to land at Guam found themselves in an even worse situation. 9 Japanese dive bombers made a desperate final attempt to attack, diving on USS Wasp and USS Bunker Hill one more time. Their bombs splashed close alongside the carriers, sending spray high onto the flight decks, but causing no significant damage. American anti-aircraft fire destroyed 8 of these 9 aircraft. Only a single plane escaped. As the main body of Japanese aircraft approached Guam for landing, exhausted and low on fuel, they must have thought their ordeal was finally over. They were tragically wrong. 27 Hellcats from American carriers had been directed to the airfield, and they arrived just as the Japanese planes were in their most vulnerable state, strung out in landing pattern with wheels and flaps down. With no time to take off and fight back, no altitude to maneuver, the Japanese aircraft were systematically shot down as they approached the runway or destroyed as they touched down. In just a matter of minutes, 30 more aircraft were obliterated, and many of the survivors that did manage to land safely were so badly damaged by strafing runs that they would never fly again. As the afternoon of June 19th wore on and the smoke finally began to clear from the Philippine Sea, the full extent of the disaster that had befallen Japan became apparent to both sides. In the space of a single day of combat, the Japanese had suffered losses that were simply unprecedented in the history of carrier warfare. Approximately 330 aircraft had been destroyed, and this figure included not only the carrier aircraft, but also most of the land-based planes that had been operating from the Marianas. Nearly half of Ozawa's entire carrier air strength had been wiped out in these few hours of combat. The Americans, by stark contrast, had lost only 23 planes, and their fleet remained virtually untouched. Aside from some casualties aboard the battleship South Dakota and relatively minor damage to a few other ships, the American force was fully operational and capable of continuing the fight. Watching wave after wave of Japanese aircraft being shot down with such apparent ease, one American pilot made an observation that would give the battle its enduring nickname. He remarked that the one-sided slaughter reminded him of an old-time turkey shoot back home, where turkeys would be released and amateur hunters would try to shoot them. From that moment forward, the Battle of the Philippine Sea would be known by Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captured both the lopsided nature of the victory and the almost casual ease with which the Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. In a single day, the elite of Japan's naval air power, painstakingly built up over years of training and combat, had been nearly wiped from existence. Yet as terrible as these losses were, the disaster for Japan was far from complete. As night began to fall across the Pacific and the last light of day faded from the western horizon, towering columns of flame still burned on the distant ocean, marking the funeral pyres of 2 Japanese aircraft carriers. While the fierce and one-sided air battles had raged in the skies above, American submarines had been operating silently in the depths below, waiting for opportunities to strike at the Japanese fleet. Early that same morning, even before the airstrikes had begun, the submarine USS Albacore had detected Admiral Ozawa's flagship Taiho through her periscope. The submarine's captain had maneuvered his boat into an ideal attack position, and now he prepared to deliver a killing blow. At 15 minutes past 8 in the morning, just as Taiho was in the midst of launching aircraft for the second strike wave, her deck alive with the roar of engines and the controlled chaos of flight operations, Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes. The deadly fish raced through the water toward their target, their white wakes visible to sharp-eyed lookouts aboard the Japanese carrier. Warning shouts rang across Taiho's bridge, and the massive ship heeled over into an emergency turn as her escorting destroyers rushed to drop depth charges on the submarine. In the confusion and desperation of the moment, a Japanese pilot named Sakio Komatsu, who had just taken off from Taiho's deck, witnessed one of the torpedoes streaking toward his ship. Making a split-second decision that demonstrated the kind of self-sacrifice that Japanese military culture both encouraged and celebrated, Komatsu deliberately dove his aircraft into the path of the torpedo. The resulting explosion destroyed both the torpedo and Komatsu's plane, killing him instantly but potentially saving his ship from a fatal hit. Taiho managed to avoid one torpedo through this sacrifice, but the carrier's luck ran out moments later when another torpedo slammed into her starboard side, tearing open a massive gash below the waterline. The torpedo's impact allowed aviation fuel from ruptured tanks to flood into compartments throughout the ship. Taiho staggered from the blow, and for a moment it seemed she might capsize, but the carrier's relatively modern design, incorporating improvements based on lessons learned from earlier battles, allowed her to remain afloat and even continue steaming. For several hours, it appeared that Taiho might survive her wound. Damage control parties worked frantically to shore up bulkheads, pump out flooded compartments, and contain the spreading fuel. By midday, tragedy struck the Japanese fleet yet again, this time targeting one of their most storied carriers. USS Kavala, another American submarine, had been shadowing the Japanese fleet for hours, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Her captain had selected as his target the carrier Shokaku, a veteran ship that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor and had fought in virtually every major carrier battle of the war. At 23 minutes past 11 in the morning, while Shokaku was busy recovering aircraft from earlier strikes and had her deck crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed, Kavala struck. The submarine fired a spread of torpedoes, and at least 3 of them struck home, slamming into Shokaku's hull with devastating effect. The explosions set off a chain reaction as aviation fuel and ordnance stored in the hangar ignited. A massive fireball engulfed the forward part of the ship, and within moments it was clear that Shokaku was doomed. The order to abandon ship was given as fires spread throughout the vessel, despite all efforts to control them. At 8 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, a final catastrophic blast tore the carrier apart. She broke in 2 pieces and sank rapidly, taking 1,263 sailors and airmen down with her. Approximately 570 survivors, including Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, were rescued by the escorting destroyers that rushed to pull men from the oil-slicked water. Meanwhile, aboard Taiho, the crew had been working desperately for hours to save their ship, and for a time it seemed their efforts might succeed. They sealed bulkheads to contain the flooding and even flooded some compartments with carbon dioxide to prevent fires. But a critical mistake, born of inexperience and the confusion of battle damage, sealed the carrier's fate. A damage control officer, lacking the experience to fully understand the danger, ordered the ship's ventilation system to be run at full power. His intention was to clear the dangerous fuel vapors that had accumulated throughout the ship. Instead, the ventilation system distributed those volatile gasoline fumes evenly throughout Taiho, creating a floating bomb waiting for any spark to set it off. At 32 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, that spark came from an electric generator. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. A chain of internal detonations ripped through the vessel, tearing apart elevator shafts, blowing out decks, and sending flames hundreds of meters into the darkening sky. Taiho, the pride of the Japanese fleet and one of their most modern carriers, shuddered violently from bow to stern and then began to slip beneath the waves. Admiral Ozawa barely escaped with his life, transferring his flag to a destroyer just before the carrier went down. Taiho took 1,650 of her crew with her to the bottom. In a single day, Japan had lost two of its most important and capable aircraft carriers to submarine attacks. These losses, combined with the destruction of most of the fleet's aircraft and pilots, represented a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. As dawn broke on June 20th, after a night of disaster and retreat, the remnants of Ozawa's battered force were steaming westward as fast as they could, hoping to escape beyond the range of American pursuit. But the Americans had no intention of letting the surviving Japanese ships escape. Admiral Spruance ordered his fleet to steam at maximum speed through the night, closing the distance. By morning, dozens of American scout planes were sweeping across the ocean in a vast search pattern, looking for any sign of the retreating enemy. On the carrier Zuikaku, now carrying Admiral Ozawa's flag as the sole surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force still afloat, the Admiral finally received the full and accurate reports of the previous day's disaster at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The news was devastating. All 4 attack waves had been virtually annihilated. His carrier air groups were down to roughly 150 operational aircraft, barely a third of what he had started with. What Ozawa did not know, because his subordinate commanders had hidden the truth from him out of shame or fear, was that nearly all of the land-based aircraft on Guam and Rota had also been destroyed. Operating under the mistaken belief that these island-based planes were still available to support him, Ozawa clung to the idea of mounting yet another strike on June 21st. Throughout the morning and into the early afternoon of June 20th, the skies remained clear but empty. American scout planes crisscrossed their search sectors methodically, but found nothing. Vice Admiral Mitcher grew increasingly restless as report after report came in with the same disappointing message: no contact with the enemy. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. Finally, at 40 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, a scout plane from USS Enterprise sighted the Japanese fleet on the far horizon and immediately rushed back a signal. But the initial report was frustratingly vague, lacking the precise coordinates needed to launch a strike. Mitcher demanded better information, and at 5 minutes past 4, the confirmation arrived with exact coordinates. The Japanese fleet was located 275 miles to the west and moving at 20 knots, continuing their retreat. Mitcher faced an agonizing decision. Time was running out rapidly. The sun would set around 6:30 that evening, leaving less than 2 hours of daylight. Any strike launched now would be flying at the absolute edge of the aircraft's range, and the returning planes would almost certainly have to land after dark, something that was extraordinarily dangerous under the best conditions. The risks were enormous, but so was the opportunity. This might be the only chance to deliver a killing blow to what remained of the Japanese carrier force. After a moment's consideration, Mitcher made his decision. The order flashed across the American carriers: launch all aircraft immediately. It was a calculated gamble, and Mitchell and his commanders knew they might lose many planes and pilots to the darkness and fuel exhaustion. But they also recognized this as potentially the decisive moment of the battle, perhaps of the entire war in the Pacific. The flight decks shook and thundered as the American carriers turned into the wind and began launching aircraft. It was an impressive display of American naval power and operational capability. Nearly the entire strength of Task Force 58 took to the air, a total of 226 planes. 95 were Hellcat fighters, but these weren't configured for air combat. Instead, they carried 500-pound bombs beneath their wings, ready to attack the Japanese ships. 54 were Avenger torpedo bombers, their capacious bomb bays loaded with deadly torpedoes. The remaining 77 aircraft were dive bombers, a mix of Curtiss Helldivers and Douglas Dauntlesses, the latter a veteran design that had proven its worth time and again. Wave after wave climbed into the late afternoon sky and set course westward in pursuit of Ozawa's fleeing force. At approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, while the Japanese fleet was conducting refueling operations, transferring precious fuel oil from tankers to the thirsty warships, a lookout suddenly spotted dark shapes approaching from the eastern sky. Air raid sirens wailed across the fleet. Ozawa scrambled his last 35 Zero fighters into the air, a pitifully small number compared to the American armada bearing down on him. The escorts tightened their formation around the carriers, and anti-aircraft crews rushed to their guns, loading and preparing to fire. Minutes later, the roar of hundreds of American aircraft engines filled the sky, and the assault began with terrifying intensity. The first American squadrons, searching for the main body of the Japanese fleet, instead stumbled across 3 Japanese oilers that were trailing behind. These tankers represented the fleet's lifeblood, carrying the fuel oil needed to keep the warships operating. With their own fuel running low and uncertain whether they could find the carriers in the fading light, some American groups made the decision to attack these targets of opportunity immediately. Bombs rained down on the vulnerable, unarmored tankers. 2 were set ablaze within minutes, fires spreading rapidly across their decks and engulfing their superstructures. A third tanker took a bomb directly into her hull and broke in half, sinking almost immediately. Massive columns of fire and thick black smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air, creating pillars that could be seen for miles across the darkening ocean. From his flagship, Admiral Ozawa could only watch in helpless fury as his precious supply ships, irreplaceable and desperately needed, went up in flames. Then the full weight of the American strike fell upon the carriers themselves. On the carrier Hio, officers barely had time to shout warnings of enemy aircraft off the port side before American torpedo bombers were making their attack runs. Avengers from USS Belleau Wood had slipped through the defensive screen and positioned themselves perfectly for a torpedo attack. The heavy aircraft dropped low over the water, released their torpedoes, and pulled up sharply to escape the anti-aircraft fire. At least 2 torpedoes, possibly more, slammed into Hio's hull below the waterline. The carrier shuddered violently from the impacts, and almost immediately she began to list as water flooded into her compartments. Black smoke poured from her wounds, engulfing the flight deck and making it impossible to launch any aircraft for defense. Fires spread with terrifying speed, fed by aviation fuel and ammunition. Damage control parties fought desperately to contain the flooding and extinguish the fires, but the damage was simply too extensive. Within 2 hours of being struck, a massive internal explosion ripped through Hio, far larger than the initial torpedo impacts. The blast tore the carrier apart, breaking her back. She broke into 2 sections and sank rapidly, taking 250 sailors with her into the depths. More than 1,000 survivors were rescued by destroyers that braved the continuing American attacks to pull men from the water. Elsewhere in the formation, other Japanese carriers came under attack. Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda all found themselves targeted by American dive bombers. Thick black smoke rose from their decks as bombs exploded, though fortunately for the Japanese, most of the bombs detonated close alongside rather than scoring direct hits. The near misses still caused damage from fragmentation and blast effects, but they didn't result in the catastrophic fires and flooding that direct hits would have caused. These carriers survived, though all were damaged to varying degrees. The battleship Haruna suffered a direct hit on one of her main turrets when a bomb penetrated the armour and detonated inside. The explosion killed and wounded many of the gun crew, and for a terrifying moment it seemed the blast might reach the magazines below, which would have resulted in the total destruction of the ship. But quick-thinking damage control officers immediately flooded the magazines, preventing a catastrophic secondary detonation. Haruna survived, though one of her main turrets was knocked out of action. After approximately half an hour of relentless bombardment, the American attack finally subsided. The last planes pulled away and headed east toward their carriers, leaving destruction in their wake. Japan had lost 3 vital fleet oilers, and the carrier Hio sunk outright, while the surviving carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda all bore scars from near misses and fragment damage. American losses in the attack amounted to approximately 20 aircraft, most shot down by anti-aircraft fire, rather than by the handful of Japanese fighters that had managed to intercept. Admiral Ozawa stood on Zuikaku's bridge, stunned into near silence as he surveyed the damage to his shattered fleet. Black smoke billowed from multiple ships, blocking out the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The grand plan for a decisive battle, the operation that was supposed to turn the tide of the war, lay in ruins around him. The dream was dead. For the Americans, however, the mission was far from over, and in many ways the most dangerous part was just beginning. The air crews who had pressed home their attacks with such determination now faced the daunting task of finding their way back to their carriers in the gathering darkness after flying nearly 300 miles. The fuel situation was critical for many aircraft, and landing on a carrier at night, even under ideal circumstances, was one of the most difficult and dangerous operations in naval aviation. At 45 minutes past 8 in the evening, the first returning American aircraft appeared in the darkening sky, their navigation lights twinkling like stars. But landing on carriers at night after such a long sortie was nearly impossible under normal operational procedures, which called for strict light discipline to avoid revealing the fleet's position to enemy submarines or aircraft. The pilots were exhausted, many were low on fuel, and some were wounded or flying damaged aircraft. On USS Hornet, Rear Admiral Joseph Clark made a bold decision. He ordered the carrier's floodlights switched on, illuminating the flight deck like a beacon in the darkness to guide the returning pilots home. Vice Admiral Mitcher, recognizing that his pilots needed every possible advantage if they were to survive, then made an even bolder choice. He ordered the entire fleet to illuminate, turning on every light available and exposing the ships to potential enemy attack, but giving his exhausted flyers a chance to find their carriers and land safely. Searchlights swept across the sky, their powerful beams piercing the darkness. Destroyers fired star shells and flares to light up the sea, creating an artificial twilight that extended for miles. And one by one, the exhausted pilots brought their planes in. The scene was chaotic. Some pilots, completely out of fuel, crash-landed on the first deck they saw, regardless of whether it was their assigned carrier. Others ditched in the ocean near the destroyers, hoping to be picked up. Still others bailed out when their engines quit, trusting that the rescue operations would find them in the dark water. Rescue operations continued throughout the long night. Destroyers crisscrossed the search area with searchlights probing the darkness, looking for pilots and aircrew floating in life rafts or clinging to wreckage. By the time dawn broke the following morning, 80 aircraft had been lost to crashes, fuel exhaustion, or water landings. But thanks to the aggressive rescue efforts, approximately 3/4 of the aircrews survived, many plucked from the sea by destroyer crews who showed tremendous courage operating so close to enemy-held waters in the darkness. Vice Admiral Mitcher was deeply aware of the cost of his decision to launch the strike so late in the day, The loss of 80 aircraft and their crews was the price of his gamble at sunset, but he had inflicted serious damage on the remaining Japanese fleet. That same night, at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Japan, Admiral Toyota read through the final reports from the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The outcome was undeniable and devastating. The battle had ended in complete disaster for Japan. He ordered Admiral Ozawa to withdraw immediately and avoid any further engagement with American forces. The American fleet pursued briefly the following day, but then halted, having secured their victory and, more importantly, having safeguarded the Saipan landings, which continued without interference from Japanese naval forces. After 2 days of intensive combat in the Philippine Sea, the ocean had witnessed the largest carrier versus carrier battle in the history of naval warfare, and the result was an overwhelming American victory. Japan had launched 373 carrier-based aircraft in 4 major waves over the course of June 19th. Of these, only 130 made it back to their carriers, and many of those survivors were subsequently lost when their carriers were sunk. Including the land-based aircraft from the Marianas and the losses from submarine attacks, Japan's total aircraft losses ranged between 475 and 550 planes. Virtually the entire elite carrier air arm had been wiped out. Admiral Ozawa was left with barely 35 operational aircraft, not enough to defend his remaining carriers, much less conduct offensive operations. In terms of ships, the toll was equally devastating and irreplaceable. 3 fleet carriers had been sunk: Taiho, Shokaku, and Hyo. 2 fleet oilers had also been destroyed, and the surviving carriers all bore damage from near misses and fragments. The Americans, by stark contrast, had suffered negligible losses. Not a single ship had been sunk. The battleship South Dakota had suffered some damage and casualties, but remained fully operational. 123 American planes had been lost, but the majority of these losses were due to nighttime landing accidents and fuel exhaustion rather than enemy action. In terms of aircrew casualties, the Americans had recovered most of their pilots, while Japan had lost not only hundreds of aircraft, but also the irreplaceable experienced pilots who had flown them. The result was nothing less than a complete and overwhelming American victory, one of the most one-sided battles in naval history. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, mockingly remembered by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, had delivered what amounted to a mortal blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. In just 2 days of combat, the elite of Japan's naval air power, built up painstakingly over years of training and accumulated combat experience, had been annihilated. Along with the aircraft, Japan had lost thousands of veteran pilots, aircrew members, and mechanics, men whose skills and experience could never be replaced given Japan's dwindling resources and training capacity. After this crushing defeat, Japan would never again be able to assemble a carrier force strong enough or skilled enough to challenge American naval supremacy anywhere in the Pacific. The carriers themselves might be repaired and returned to service, but without aircraft and without pilots, they were little more than floating targets. 4 months later, during the decisive Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, Admiral Ozawa would still nominally command Japan's carrier force. Yet his carriers sailed with virtually no planes on their decks. They served only as decoys, a desperate and tragic ruse designed to lure the American fleet away from the real battle being fought by Japanese surface ships. The once proud carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor and rampaged across the Pacific in the early months of the war had been reduced to bait, sacrificial pawns in a losing game. From a strategic perspective, the American victory at the Battle of the Philippine Sea opened the door wide for the Allies to seize the Mariana Islands without meaningful interference from Japanese naval forces. Soon after the battle, Saipan fell to American forces, followed by Tinian and Guam. The loss of these islands tore a fatal breach in Japan's so-called absolute defense line, the outer perimeter that was supposed to protect the home islands from direct attack. From newly constructed airfields on the Marianas, American B-29 Superfortress bombers began launching devastating strategic bombing raids against the Japanese mainland, reducing major cities to burning ruins and crippling what remained of Japanese industrial capacity. In every sense, in every possible measure, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 marked the definitive confirmation of America's absolute naval and air supremacy in the Pacific theater. It heralded the inevitable and irreversible decline of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Second World War. The Turkey Shoot, as it would be remembered, was not just a battle, but a turning point, the moment when Japan's last realistic hope of contesting American dominance at sea died in the flames of 300 burning aircraft falling from the Philippine sea sky.